Call Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I actually think Mr Bishop is wrong. It's been a very measured debate, and rightly so. It's a very serious issue that we have to deal with very quickly. And I've appreciated the analysis from all sides of the House, probably about that one, so far, each of which has shed some light on both the process and the content of this legislation and why it's so important. I would just want to reflect on two issues raised by the Minister, Amy Adams. One was about the process, and she described how a great deal of policy work goes into an issue like this, and that criticising the 12 days of drafting, sounds funny when you say it like that, the 12 days of drafting doesn't acknowledge the amount of work that goes into policy development. And I agree, when you're working on new policy in particular, complicated policy, it takes a lot of time and a lot of work. The actual construction of the final legislation doesn't take as much time once you've got the policy settings right. And the concerns from the opposition have been that in the process of developing the policy, the government has not looked outside of its own confines to find out what the right options might be. My own colleague, David Clendon, offered to talk with her about those policy settings in July and was refused. They didn't want to talk with any of the opposition members about this. I'm not sure whether Labor was able to have a direct conversation about the policy as it was in operation. There's no indication from government that they went and talked with agencies outside of government agencies, like the Law Commission, like the Human Rights Commission, agencies that they can trust to keep information confidential. I mean, these are major institutions in New Zealand, and they are just as capable of keeping information confidential. But to get the point of policy development is you get new ideas about how to deal with a problem, and you find as many different ideas as possible, constructive ideas on how to deal with the problem, and then you try to build the best policy out of it. That is why you talk with other people outside of the confines of your own office. It's why you go and find experts from outside the parliamentary process who are less invested in the politics and the pressure of the issue and much more interested in the effect of the legislation on the community as a whole. That's why we have a select committee process. We have a select committee process because we want New Zealanders to tell us how this legislation will affect them. What are the areas of their lives that we don't know anything about that will be affected, and how could we improve it if the effect is bad, and what might we want to support more if the effect is good? That's the point of the democratic process of discussion and consultation. If in a wiser process would have been something like Ruth Dyson actually used to do when she was minister, and she would call in the spokespeople on the particular issue she was dealing with as minister, and we would all go to her office from across the political spectrum and hear where their policy development is going, what she was thinking about doing, what the pros and cons were. We could talk to her about that collectively so we could hear each other's ideas, and better policy was developed as a result. But early on in the process, and on something as critical as this legislation, that would have been a wiser course. We've had the entire year to enable proper consultation across the Parliament and with the experts outside of Parliament, and none of that happened. And that is why we have a bill where already there's been some issues raised. And I would then touch on Kelvin Davis's example of a story of a young man who's currently being detained, where it is completely unclear what part of this legislation he would be covered by. Would he be a returning prisoner because he's been detained and there's some complications around his detention? Would he be a returning offender, which has less oversight? How does that young man know where he fits in the legislation? And legislation that deals with the criminal law, that deals with the coercive powers of the state to detain and question you, should be as clear as possible for every single New Zealander, particularly those who are going to be subject to that law. And this is the kind of example and that would be raised in a select committee, where experts will be able to have a look at how the law applies to that situation and perhaps another few, to see where the gaps are in the legislation that need to be filled and provide that advice to the Parliament so we can build a better law. That is why the Greens have said so strongly we need to have at least a short period of a select committee inquiry to investigate that, because we don't want to be supporting bad law that doesn't work, bad law that is confusing, Bad law that captures people who shouldn't be captured and infringes their human rights. Bad law that fails to capture the people who pose a significant risk to the public safety of New Zealanders but manage to fall outside the cracks. We don't want to pass law like that. We want to pass good law. And we can't do that in a circumstance where it has been drafted hastily, the policy has been developed without any consultation, and there's no chance of an external review from the experts who deal with this sort of stuff every day on the ground. And I would just finally end, Sir, on Amy Adams' own words, where she said, you know, the drafting of this policy, the law, could have gone one step too far, could have been one step too low. The problem, of course, is that we don't know that. We don't know whether the balance has been struck because we haven't got any advice or any information from anywhere but within the Minister's own office. And it's not adequate when you're in the law-making process. It's not what the democratic law-making process should be about. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.